We are now over a month into 2021, and I have been doing both some future worship planning as well as some looking back on the year that was. As I said during the announcements, we'll have a congregational meeting in a couple weeks when we'll present the annual report for the year 2020, a year that is unlike any other that the church has experienced in its life. And it's weird. It's hard. I was looking back at our calendar and seeing that last year we had our first ever virtual worship service on March 22nd. And then the week after that, the session voted to close the sanctuary and suspend all in-person events through May 12th. Which at the time seemed like a really, really long time. Little did we know, right? Soon enough, it became clear that we would be foregoing hugs and handshakes, not just for weeks, but for months. People began to realize that we were going to need some serious coping skills. Big conferences, weddings, gatherings were first postponed to the fall, and then postponed further or canceled or modified completely. We all became very knowledgeable about public health protocols for global pandemics. And we began to accept that a lot of things we love most about life, crowding into stadiums, bars, and friends' living rooms for events like the Super Bowl, to give one example, were going to be different or just on hold for a long time. Until we were told they developed a vaccine. A vaccine would be the silver bullet, the decisive triumph of human ingenuity over the evil pathogen, the golden ticket for the return trip back to normalcy. And so we now have that vaccine that they literally did develop at warp speed. Quicker and more effective at stopping the virus than even the most optimistic hopes of most experts. But now, as you know, we have mutations and variants. It's like a bad fantasy or science fiction movie where the monster just refuses to die and keeps coming back, so they make sequel after sequel after sequel. You can read all these newspaper articles about all the precautions you're supposed to take even after you've gotten the vaccine. You still need to wear a mask. You still need to avoid gatherings, not only because of the variants and mutations, but it's possible that vaccinated people could still spread the virus even if they don't get sick, because we don't know how long the immunity will last, because you might be among the 5 or 10% of people for whom the vaccine doesn't work. And I know that none of this is what you want to hear in a sermon today from your pastor. But I say all of it because if you are like me, you are just so tired. I am so tired of this pandemic. I am so tired of wearing masks. I'm so tired of feeling angry and judgmental at people in public who don't wear masks. I'm so tired of reading that I'm supposed to be wearing 2 masks. I'm tired of my kids getting sent home from preschool for 3 days just because they had a runny nose or the slightest fever. I'm so tired of taking turns with my spouse trying to support each other in the midst of parenting and being confined and work pressures and Zoom meetings. I'm tired of wondering how safe it is to travel. I'm tired of not being supposed to sing in groups gathered close together. I'm tired of not hugging. I'm tired of not worrying about wearing deodorant because no one is getting close enough to me to smell me anyway. I'm so tired of trying to balance our emotional and spiritual health with our physical safety. Biblical scholar Kristen Wendland writes that the chapters of Isaiah from which Sharon just read address a tired and weary people who likely had some trouble imagining a new future. They proclaim God's strength in the face of human weakness, God's permanence in the face of human finitude, God's endurance in the face of human exhaustion. You see, God's people had been conquered by the Babylonian Empire. They had been captured and forced into exile, subjugated by a people who worship what any observer at the time would infer to be superior gods, because they had been defeated. And to that trauma, the prophet Isaiah speaks hope. The same prophetic voice who had predicted the people's suffering and defeat, who declared it to be a foregone conclusion and consequence for the people's unfaithfulness to God, rather than God's apparent defeat by foreign idols, that prophet now says, just a few verses earlier, those words from Messiah, right? That the people's penalty has been paid, that their sentence has been served, and that they must now remember who they are, which really means they must remember who is the God that they serve. Have you not known? Have you not heard? Has it not been told to you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is the Lord who sits above the circle of the earth, and to God the earth's inhabitants are like insects. God stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them out like a tent to live in. God, your God, brings princes to naught and makes the rulers of the earth as nothing. Scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely has their stem taken root in the earth, when God blows upon them and they wither, and the tempest carries them off like stubble. Do you not remember the God that you proclaim to worship and believe in? I ran track in high school, and even though I was a preacher's kid, I best knew the words of Isaiah 40:31 from all the private schools we ran against that had that verse printed on their t-shirts. Those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. But this context of having been in exile, having been extracted from their homeland, gives new meaning or proper meaning for those words. The mission of the God of Israel isn't to empower high achievers to set new personal records and enjoy greater success. No, those words are directed to a people who are down and out, who have come to the end of their hope, who've come to the end of their patience. But I bring up the running metaphor because actually I think it can help us understand further the context of what not just the exile looked like, but what the return looked like. When the people were called to leave Babylon and allowed to go back to Jerusalem. If you're doing a run or a walk or a hike out and back to a certain destination for the first time, if you've ever done that, you know that the trip out always seems longer than the return trip. On the way out, you don't know exactly where you're going, so you keep thinking, okay, it's just going to be around this corner, it's just a little bit further, but it ends up being longer. You don't know how to pace yourself because you're never quite sure how much you have left. But once you've made it to where you're going and you turn around, you know the path. It doesn't seem so hard when you know exactly where it is that you're going to end up. So one would think that the return trip home to Jerusalem from the exile would be just on its own, just by virtue of the fact that they're going back to what they know, that it would be energizing and inspiring and life-giving. They're going back. Earlier in the chapter, Isaiah's already proclaimed that they're turning around and that they're being given a fast track to go home. He's already said just a few verses earlier, in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God and for the people. Every valley is going to be lifted up, every mountain and hill made low. The uneven ground will become level, the rough places will become plain, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed. So where is all of this exhaustion in today's verses coming from? Dr. Charles Aaron Jr., a professor at Perkins School of Theology, writes that verse 31, which I've read, actually does not depict an eagle spreading its wings to soar and mount up, but rather a molting eagle who exchanges old wings for new. He continues, in one sense, the prophet offers encouragement to go back. The scattered exiles can go back to Jerusalem from the far-flung regions of Babylon. In reality, though, they do not go back. They go forward. They accept a new adventure. In chapter 43, verse 19, Isaiah writes that God does a new thing. The people will go back, but in reality, everything has changed. They cannot go back. They can only move forward into God's new future. The promised land to which they return is not the same as when they left. So the exhaustion and the pain that the exiles bear on their return journey is more than just the trauma of having been forced to leave. They return home not only bearing the scars from having been oppressed so long, but also carrying the grief born out of the slow realization that the glorious return of which they had long dreamed, envisioned, and hoped would be different from the return of reality. Indeed, according to the book of Nehemiah, after the exiles return and rebuild God's temple, which had been destroyed when they were conquered by the Babylonians, at that dedication of the second, smaller, less impressive new temple, Nehemiah writes, there is cheering that is mixed with tears. Yes, the business of death and resurrection is hard. The resurrection body is not a revival of the old way of life. It's not a resuscitation of tradition whose time had already been completed. It is the fulfillment of the promise that God is indeed doing a new thing. Another biblical scholar, Joseph Blenkinsop, sees careful deliberateness in God, in Isaiah's choice to describe God in this passage as a creator in verse 26. Because that is what the exiles would be doing in that historical moment. Creating new traditions, new rituals, new ways of living. It's just what is also needed in our current historical moment. We are indeed on the path home from exile. But the normal to which we are going is not a return, is not a journey back, but a journey forward, a new chapter, a new beginning that God has planted that will be even greater. So we are creating new ways to gather. There will be new ways to worship, new ways to do school and church and weddings and funerals and celebration and travel. It is hard. It is exhausting. But there's another kernel of hope that is hidden in this text, that's hidden in that verse 31. You see, this difficult task of creating something new is actually quite old. This new task of reforming traditions, resurrecting, renewing rituals and ways of being is actually part of our tradition. You see, when Isaiah says that those who wait for God will mount up with wings like eagles, he's alluding to Exodus chapter 19. Another wilderness time for God's people. Another time of exhaustion and doubt. When God says, "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and how I brought you out to myself." Thus, as they go on the new path, Isaiah is telling the people to remember that God has done this before. The people have this in their DNA. The people have done this before. God is bringing them out of exile into something new, just as God freed them from slavery and brought them out of Egypt into something new. The comforting rituals and practices that they lost in exile used to be new things that were created in the wilderness outside of Egypt. Friends, it may be exhausting and terrifying and brand new, but we have done exhausting and terrifying and brand new before. The same God that was with us then is with us now and will be with us forever. And those who trust in that God will walk and not faint, will run and not grow weary. Those who trust in that God will be borne up on eagle's wings. Let us go forward with that God together. Amen.